Alright, welcome to Trump Reviews Naxxramas, with Goblins and Gnomes right around the corner, and with me reviewing several Goblins vs. Gnomes cards. I thought it would be a good idea to look back at Naxxramas. It's mostly been figured out at this point. A lot of the decks have been played. Pretty much all of the Naxxramas cards have seen some amount of play or experimentation with, and it's kind of interesting to see what I thought of the cards back when they were new. Undertaker. This is a really efficient minion. I think it's going to spawn a completely different type of zoo where you have Undertaker. It should be best in zoo because the Warlock hero ability keeps giving you cards, and most of the good Death Rattle cards are in zoo. I think this could be one of the top cards of the future. In Arena, it sucks. Okay, so that was right. One thing I did miss was that hunters actually have a lot of ways to death rattle the Undertaker with... Oh man, this card is new OP. I think this card is going to be played in every single deck which is not right in your face. And you wouldn't put this in the heavy control decks which don't have very many minions either, like Miracle Rogue or Freeze Mage. But otherwise, it's a 1 mana 2/3. And that usually costs 2 mana, and when you reduce a minion's mana cost by 1, and that's really good unless there's like a crippling drawback. This drawback isn't actually that big. This card will also be insane in Arena, since pretty much the goal of Arena is to board control. Zombie Chow. It is in fact pretty good against anti-aggro. I overemphasized that it would be in every deck. I thought it would be a mainstay in warrior control. Priest control turns out to use it a bit, and Druid ramp does use it sometimes. In Arena, it proves to be as good as I thought it was. Even just by itself, it's a 2 mana 2/4, 2 mana 2/1/2s. And if you play it with something like a Shattered Sun Cleric, it's a 5 mana 2/3, 2/3, and 3/2 for a total of 7, 5, 8, 10. 7/10 of stats for 5 mana in a really good spread. It might replace Haunted Creeper in case there's not enough room for both. In Arena, this card should also be just very good. Alright, well, first of all, that's 7, 8 in stats. Echoing Ooze turns out to have been attempted in Zoo, and it was just eventually figured out that it wasn't quite good enough. For a time being, there were like 2 different sides of Zoo. One was the one that ran with Undertaker, and then there was one which actually didn't run with Undertaker for some time. But eventually people realized that the Undertaker version was far superior. Echoing Ooze turns out to still be used in Druid mainly due to Savage Roar. You're already seeing this card get a lot of constructed play in Zoo, in control decks. You could argue it to be a 2 mana 3/4, or maybe a 2 mana 2/4 if you were to consider the maximum damage potential of this. And that's really strong because usually on 2 mana you only get 2 3s, or 3 2s. It's also just generally good in Arena because it's a value card. It's also excellent against Area of Effect, so you can just play it and overextend, but you have more stuff. It's turned out to be really good in both the Zoo and the Hunter, quite importantly, because it's actually a beast. It also turns out in a few control decks, and in Shaman, and in Druid, because having more guys is really good for Savage Run and Flame Tongue Totem. Mad Scientist. Probably sees the most play in Mage and Paladin. This is Mage and Hunter. It's a tough card to evaluate because, well, nothing quite does anything like this. Loot Hoarder is a 2 mana 2/1 Death Rattle draw card. Mad Scientist, 2 mana 2/2 Death Rattle, draw and play a card. Mages have a lot of things to do with secrets. You could see a Mage secret deck seriously be into consideration with the Mad Scientist. In Arena, this card's gonna be mediocre. It depends a lot whether or not you have a secret with it, really. Mad Scientist, by the way, could fit into constructed Freeze Mage pretty well, since it's another way to get your ice blocks / ice barriers. I don't think anyone really knew just how good Mad Scientist would be for a Hunter. Most people thought it would be really good in Mage. It turns out to be one of the best cards in Hunter. It's just one of those cards which, in practice, turned out to be really good. And yes, it did see play in all those Freeze Mage decks too. Turns out to be every bit as theoretically good as it is. And it buffed Undertaker. There was so much synergy going on. Reynad was actually one of the ones who correctly called this card as one of the most OP cards and said Hunter would be the best deck ever just because of it. Some people were actually expecting it to even get nerfed afterwards, but it didn't, and Hunter has ultimately ended up being a very strong competitive class, but there have been ways to beat it. Some very strong Hearthstone players have even not brought Hunter to tournaments at this point because they feel that it doesn't match their lineup, or they feel it's weaker than the 4 other classes that they can play. The Rhubar Weblord, it's very good anti-aggro, based on the stats, since you kill their 2-1 and then you still have a lot. Aggro currently, at this moment, isn't very popular. But really, the Rhubar Weblord ends up being a metagame call if there's a lot of cards out there with Battlecry. There was some experimentation with this against Miracle Rogue, since most of their cards come with a Battlecry, and against Zoo, since a lot of their cards come with a Battlecry. Even in recent tournaments, you saw some Miracle decks play Rhubar Weblord to counter other Miracle decks. I thought that was kind of weird. Basically, it's good or bad depending on how many cards with Battlecry are out there. In Arena, this card isn't going to be that good. 2 mana 1/4 isn't that strong, but it will be stronger in classes which can deal 1 damage, like Mage, Rogue, and Druid, since then you can kill their 3/2 and still have a surviving Weblord. This card's okay in Arena. This review, by the way, the review that Past Trump is doing, was done about, I'm going to say, there wasn't the second set of Naxx yet, so a few days into the release of Naxx. That Weblord was seeing some play, and in Miracle Rogue, actually, in order to combat Zoo, and Miracle Rogue to stop Azure Drake, and it was not their best idea. Card definitely dropped off a lot and has never seen any play since. Nerubian Egg. This card is part of what has pushed Zoo to be even stronger. The egg is really strong. You play it on turn 2, or you coin it out on turn 1, and then on turn 2, or the next turn after, you play Abusive Sergeant, you trade with your opponent's 3/2, and you get a 4/4. The Nerubian Egg is so good that you've seen some Zoo actually run Power Overwhelming and Void Terror as well, just to eat the egg, or to eat anything else that you Power Overwhelm. In Arena, it sucks because you can't actually activate the egg that often, unless you can, and then it gets better. Yep, pretty much right there. Although surprisingly, when this Nerubian Egg thing first came out, I actually tried to put it in every single deck because I thought it was going to be super OP. I actually brought all Nerubian Egg decks to the first tournament post-Naxx. Zoo, Paladin, Shaman with Flame Tongues, and there's one more thing. And I even put it in Rogue, Aggro Rogue, because then you put Cold Blood on it and Direwolf Alpha, and I thought even that was good enough. Now, as it turns out, it's only really being popular in Zoo now. So, not nearly as OP as I thought it was. Unstable Ghoul. This card, I think, fits a very specific deck, which is the Warrior control deck. Or maybe just heavy control in general, since the stats are good. 2 mana for a 1/3 of Taunt, and it will deal 2 damage to whatever attacks into it. You see some synergy with this and cards that like to take damage, like Acolyte of Pain, which is again why this card might be great in Warrior, and Frothing Berserker, and all that In Arena, this card is okay. About average. Wow, you were really good on that one, Trump. Dancing Swords, a 3 mana 4/4. But the Death Rattle is pretty significant. Card fits into 2 really specific playstyles. One is one of those really backspace tempo rogues. Well, the problem with Dancing Swords is we've already got 3 mana 4/3s with no drawback, Injured Blade Master, which are not being played. 1 extra point of health often is a pretty big deal. But the question is it worth the Death Rattle? And general consensus is no, but who knows, maybe in the super aggressive decks. Some people have also suggested a milling type deck where you force your opponent to draw cards. I still think such a deck is a bit far away from completion. In Arena, since Arena is based off of value, Dancing Swords is not good enough. It's going to be one of the weaker cards. Having your opponent draw a card is too good for your opponent. Mill decks still do suck. Reynad was one of the people who tried Dancing Swords in tournaments most famously, and he didn't do very well with it. Dancing Swords turns out to just not be worth the death rattle value side effects still. Deathlord. This card is a game changer. So one of the big things that I love about trading card games are cards which are over budgeted but have a super big weakness, super big drawback I should say. That'd be a card like Nerubian Egg and like Ancient Watcher. Deathlord is one of those cards. On 3 mana you're supposed to get a 1/4 with Taunt. I'm looking at you, Silverback, Patriarch, Gorilla, whatever you are. Is that the only one? Oh no, there's Grizzly Bear, right. Ironbark Grizzly. So 3 mana, you're supposed to get a 3/3 with Taunt. This card is going to be amazing against Zoo. The stats are so good that even Zoo might run it. This card's dangerous and volatile, but I think it should be really strong. And in Arena, believe it will be quite strong, but it's one of those cards where you need to see in action to know just how insane it is, I think. This is one of those cards that you have to be really careful with when you're making as Blizzard, because like, is it overpowered? It could be, but it's hard to say. But it's a really cool card design. It was a cool design, and I actually used the card to run a priest deck to really, really high legend early on. And that was mainly because everyone was playing Zoo with the Nerubian Egg thing. And it was like one of the MVPs of the deck. As the number of Zoos fell off and I faced other decks, the Deathlord ended up being a pretty bad card, and now it is pretty much in obscurity. And in Arena, it's turned out to actually be a weak card. I still stand by that it's really interesting design, and it is good that Blizzard is taking risks, like putting 10 stat worth of card on a 3 mana card. It's a cool design. You play it, and on your turn, it's a 3 mana 3/3 if it survives their turn, with stealth. So there were some decks which ran Stranglethorn Tiger a few ways back, control decks, which would leave it there, usually Druids, and then you force Savage Roar, and then you have a Tiger with you, you do extra damage. So you can get that running quite a bit earlier with Shade of Naxxramas. You could even see it be played in specific decks, such as a buff deck. You play it, and then you buff it quite a few times as a paladin, or as a rogue, or as a priest. It's a good target to Divine Spirit, Inner Fire. So this is one of those cards where you have to wait and see. If you're up against a lot of Zoo, this card is probably too slow. In Arena though, this card is really good since you can actually choose when to reveal your shade, and then start doing the value trading. It's a good value card. Well, I was mouthing a druid. It turns out that I severely underestimated how strong Innervate Shade of Naxxramas was, or Coin Wild Growth in the Shade of Naxxramas. It's so strong when starting out. Druid is actually the only deck that it's seeing any serious play in, although it has come and gone in really late game control decks, especially when the format was more control heavy. You saw Paladins actually existing and then possibly putting in Shade of Naxxramas in. You see it every once in a while in control decks to try to emulate the success that Druid has with it, but no other deck really gets to do it. I was thinking that it would be run in like a Paladin combo deck where you put the Shade, it grows a few turns, you put King's Blessing of Might, Bless Champion on. That never actually happened though. Welcome to the worst card in the game, in Naxxramas. There are a few people here who tout this card and say, oh my gosh, you put Mark of the Wild or Mark of Nature on it, and it's amazing. The stats are terrible. 2 mana 1/4, I was saying, it needs something pretty good for it. 3 mana 1/4. Now, the ability is pretty good, but it's not insane either. There's going to be some people who try really hard to make this work, and then it's just no good. Speaking of this, like if you want to do a Mark of the Wild type thing, you put in Ooze. Because this card is really bad when you don't combo it with a card. Ooze, though, is okay by itself, since you have 2 mana 1/2 and 1/2. In Arena, this card is really bad, because you will not be able to get the combo-y cards. And even if you do, you still shouldn't get Stone Skin Gargoyle. This card is probably worse than Wisp in Arena. Alright, it is actually still worse than Wisp in Arena. And furthermore, to those of you who commented on the first review that, oh man, Trump is wrong, look at the insane potential of this card, you put the buffs on it, and well, you were wrong. I was right. Baron Rivendare. A really interesting card. Your minions trigger their death rattles twice. This kind of is like Cult Master, where you want to play it when you're about to send your death rattle guy off to die, but it is a lot more durable than Cult Master, at least. You might see this in the Undertaker deck, but it costs so much that you might not even see it there, because how good can your death rattles really be? You might think that this is a natural fit for the Undertaker deck, because you're going to be playing all these death rattle cards, and perhaps it will be reasonable. In Arena, this card will suck, because it'll be Turtle, but with 1 attack instead of 2. Turtle's actually good because you can kill off 3 2s. I mean, while we're talking about the Undertaker deck, I think an Undertaker deck is going to look more like Zoo, instead of be a deck with value death rattles like Cairn Bloodhoof, for example, and Sylvanas. It'll be something that looks like Zoo, except it'll run a few more death rattles, which perhaps aren't currently run, like Loot Hoarder, and perhaps it'll be more aggressive with cards like Lepernim. One of the things I did miss is that the Undertaker was so good that it was also run in the deck with Cairn and Sylvanas, and that was like in the specific death rattle priest deck. Baron Rivendare turned out to be correct to be lukewarm on. It was experimented with mainly on Crusher Shaman, and it was attempted and Reincarnate and Sylvanas and Cairn, and it never really worked out. But it gave it its shot, and it still remains. There are some cool death rattles in Goblins versus Gnomes. Maybe it will still be played, but for much the same reason that it's not played now, it costs too much, it's too slow. I anticipate the same thing in Goblins versus Gnomes. Let's talk about Wailing Soul. This is one of those cards where I doubt you're ever going to play in your deck naturally. It seems like a very specific counter card to Freeze Mage or a debuffing class deck, which isn't really out there right now. Some people have stated the equality combo that you can do with here, where you play equality and you play Wailing Soul and you get a full heal on your minions. That's not worth a deck slot. I mean, it's got reasonable stats, and there's some value in playing this with Ancient Watchers. In Arena, this card is actually going to not be too bad just because of its stats. It's obviously going to be worse than Violet Teacher, but in Arena, your Violet Teacher doesn't trigger too much anyways. The silence your other minions might have some benefits, although in Arena, it might have some downsides. It's an okay card. Yeah, Arena-wise, it turns out to be okay. Like, slightly less good than I thought, mainly because the Naxxramas cards kind of boosted overall power level, so that a 4-mana 3/5 with no text turns out to be, like, I thought it would be even good, just a 4-mana 3/5, but 4-mana 3/5 I think is now average to slightly below average, and the silence is generally negative. For the most part, in Constructed, Wailing Soul never saw play. There was some experimentation with the Ancient Watcher plus Wailing Soul deck, and then like you can also put Dancing Swords in there to silence it off, but it was never quite better than just a standard deck. Foygan, 5-mana 4/7. This one, the stats are pretty good, since on a 5-mana card you would expect to get a 5/6. Actually, currently there's not even a 5-mana 5/5 out there. So a 5-mana 5/6 has been talked about as possibly pretty good, like the Yeti Killer. A 4/7 is not necessarily better or worse than a 5/6, because 5 is a nice number to kill a Yeti, although Yeti is currently not that popular. I'm being informed it's called Fugan. Alright. And then when you are adding this 5-mana 4/7 for the stats, then you're going to be like, oh man, maybe I want to put in Stalag, since Fugan is already in here. Because if you somehow get together the Stalag Fugan Megatron, then you summon Thaddeus. Wow. 11/11. Oh man. Probably going to be in a late game control deck if you decide to run both. So I think you could potentially see it in a late game control deck, the Fugan Stalag. Mostly because these two cards don't suck in their own. It's worth mentioning that Stalag is quite worse than Fugan, because Fugan's stats are a lot better. In Arena, Stalag is going to really suck. It's a core Houndy type minion, which has too few health. But Fugan, though, is actually going to rank in the probably above 75 percentile of legendaries, just because of the stats. 5 mana, 4/7 is really good. Alright, well that was exactly right. For the most part, maybe Fugan Stalag would see more play in control-oriented decks, and it was experimented with in like the Warrior control deck, and even Shaman. Oh, that was part of the Crusher Shaman also. Priest control, but it just turns out that having both of them in a aggro metagame is far too slow. That's actually a set of cards that could see a comeback if the metagame ever moves slower. A lot of hype over this card. Heralded in as the Miracle Killer. See it very popular right now. Rightfully so. 5 mana, 5/5, reasonable stats. I have tended to be of the less enthusiastic person about this card. It's really good against spell-heavy decks, but against minion/spell-heavy hybrids or minion-heavy hybrids, Loatheb will often just limit their options in a minion/spell combo, and in a minion-heavy deck like Zoo, Loatheb's just a 5 mana 5/5, which isn't very good in constructed. So whether or not this card is really good depends on how many Miracle Rogues and Freeze Mages are out there, really. Now, there have been some really good players whose opinions I respect a lot, which have said, like, Loatheb, you throw this into every single deck. But in a world where you throw Loatheb into every single deck, like, that makes your matchup against Zoo worse, so maybe Zoo rises and then maybe the Loatheb goes away. But who knows, maybe it is good enough to justify in a lot of things. In Arena, this card is actually not that exciting because you'll usually not have that many spells. Suffice it to say, though, Loatheb is actually a card that you can legitimately put in every deck. It's like a secure the win card when your opponent has nothing on the board. But in the case that you're facing off an opponent which has stuff on the board, which is a very common deck right now, the Zoo, Loatheb, yeah. I was about to say that I underestimated it, but I got more right at the end. 5 mana, 5/5. Yeah, it's worse. I actually have been one of the people who still has had a smaller opinion on Loatheb over others as the game goes on, but probably the most played legend out of all cards. I also made this review kind of thinking that Zoo was going to be everywhere. The target turns out to be not Zoo, which means almost every deck other than Zoo runs spells. And even if you play it against the aggro hunter, like sometimes you cause their Hunter's Mark to cost 5, or you cause their kill command to cost 8, and that matters a lot. Is it as good as everyone thought it was? I think it's still slightly less good than people thought. Like, people were calling for the nerf on Loatheb. Turns out to not have needed a nerf. And it turns out that not every deck runs it. Turns out that it's a valid choice in every deck. A fair card, perhaps. Sludge Belcher. Some people look at this card and are like, oh man, it's Taz Dingo, costs 1 more mana and you get a Gold Shard Footman. Like, oh, it sucks. Gold Shard Footman sucks. But it's better than it looks, and it's tough to explain why. Having a 1/2 is good enough to escape the hero abilities. So against a Miracle Rogue, for example, they have to kill the Belcher, and then killing a 1/2 isn't trivial, they can't just use a dagger. Against Zoo, you often would have to run 1 card buffed into it, and then you have to use another card to kill the 1/2. You have to do specific math to get through it. It's kind of like the mirror image effect, where your opponent can't help but overkill it in a horrible way. This card's going to be really good in Arena, because Fen Creeper is average, and this card is quite a bit better than Fen Creeper, I'd say. Turned out to be good enough to actually be played in a lot of decks, including Hunter, which is kind of a surprise. It's played in Hunter mostly because, well, it's played in Hunter because 1, there's Undertaker, 2, and Sludge Belcher turns out to counter Hunter pretty well. I'd say Sludge Belcher was a card that kind of surprised most everyone how good it was, because when it first came out, there was, like, just the comparison to Taz Dingo. It costs 1 more, you get a Gold Shard Footman, woo. But it turns out that 3/5 is really good in stats, and getting that extra 1/2 for the metagame just turned out to be good because it counters so many things like Force Savage. It's actually going to be a card that I think is not necessarily going to keep its status with Goblins versus Gnomes if the aggro metagame dies out. Some people have said that this is going to be one of the best cards in Naxxramas. These people are the same people who say Loatheb is one of the best cards. But I myself am a bit more skeptical about the Loatheb and Spectral Knight love, because they are very strong against spell-heavy decks, but against minion-heavy decks, which is kind of what this Naxxramas set pushed things towards, a bit of a slower pace and a bit more focus on minions. It's just a 5-mana 4/6, Spiteful Smith. It's actually, strangely enough, cards like Loatheb and Spectral Knight help Zoo, because people will be playing cards like this, and then they'll be worse against Zoo. Arena is pretty minion focused, so this card is actually not that much better than Spectral Smith. But it is better than Spectral Smith. It's a similar way of how Fairy Dragon isn't that much better than Bloodfin Raptor. Recently, by the way, I've kind of changed my opinion on Spectral Knight in Arena. I think it's substantially better than I rated it at, and substantially better than I rated it for some time. Turns out that I was right, though, that it was overestimated, partially because, like, Hearthstone was all Miracle Rogue all the time before Nax. Spectral Knight only sees play in Druid these days, mostly because they want targets on the ground that they can Savage Roar. Post-Nax, a lot of people were playing it in control decks as well, but that turned out to stop being the case when people found out that it wasn't actually that good. This card costs 8. I will just compare it to Magic the Gathering, I guess. In Magic the Gathering, there's a saying where if a card costs 6 or more, you need to win the game with it. Well, back when I played. It's kind of similar in Hearthstone, where if you play a card that's 8+, you kind of need to win the game with it. This card not only requires you to have a setup of already having a board, it also doesn't completely win you the game. Like, you have to have a very specific setup. Basically, it costs too much. And yes, there's times where you get the Kel'Thuzad out, and you actually have guys, it'll be amazing, but getting yourself into that position is really tough. So, probably no good. In Arena, this card's actually going to be pretty good. The stats are not bad. In Constructed, the stats are reasonable, and in fact, dodges Big Game Hunter notably, but it's not that exciting still. 8 mana is just too much. You know, there was actually a very famous tournament moment where someone tried to kill Kel'Thuzad with Big Game Hunter, and it didn't work. So Kel'Thuzad was tried out in a lot of control decks, and ultimately it was decided that it didn't work. Partially because the metagame moved faster, partially because Ragnaros and Ysera did the job better, and you couldn't fit too many of them in a deck. Myexna, this card sucks. It's worse than Boulderfist Ogre. Why? Because Boulderfist Ogre is 6 mana, 6/7. At the cost of 1 less health, you have 4 more attack. You might argue Myexna has like an infinite attack and then 8 health, but that's not the case because sometimes you hit your opponent's face, and Myexna only softly massages the opponent's face. It's a beast which has some benefits in Hunter. You put a Houndmaster on it and it's really big, but still not good enough. In Arena, the card's okay, just because Boulderfist Ogre is really, really good in Arena. And that card is slightly worse than Boulderfist Ogre, but if you have a card worse than Boulderfist Ogre, it still could be good. Yep, Myexna does turn out to suck, but you turn out to see it more than you would expect because Webspinner gets Myexna all the time. And that's when you see her. Yeah, it just costs too much. Webspinner is unremarkable, in the same way that Loot Hoarder and Novice Engineer are unremarkable. But just because a card is unremarkable doesn't mean it's like a cog in the engine. You compare it to Loot Hoarder. Loot Hoarder is 2 mana, 2/1 Death Rattle, draw a card. Webspinner is a 1 mana, 1/1 Death Rattle, draw a card. The card you get is random and sometimes sucks, but the mana cost is reduced by 1. And it's a beast, which means you can synergize it with cards like Starving Buzzard and Hyena and Houndmaster. And overall, I think it warrants a spot in Hunter decks. In Arena, it's really good, because it is a 1 mana, 1/1. The random beast card is going to be even better in Arena. Like, it doesn't do much, but it's 1 mana, and it doesn't give you card disadvantage. So it's like, yeah, it's pretty good. Alright, well, it's a little bit better than pretty good. I will mention that a lot of people thought this was going to be one of the worst class cards, but I was like, oh, I think it'll actually warrant a spot in all the Hunter decks. And it turns out that it's especially good because Undertaker turned out to be a thing. By the way, if you can imagine this, when Nax came out, there was some decks that didn't run Undertaker and Hunter, they had some advantages. Oh, that was mainly because Starving Buzzard still cost 2. But anyways, there were 2 different sides. Eventually people decided the Undertaker version was really good, and then naturally you put Webspinner in just because of that. It's kind of a domino effect where because Undertaker is commonly agreed as so good, the Webspinner is actually way better than it was thought of. But even without the Undertaker, I was thinking, okay, that's going to be good enough. Void Caller. This is one of those cards which is not currently good in any established deck, but could be good in a deck that ran Inferno and Doomguard. So you could pretty much see a demon-focused deck. You might even see a control deck with Void Caller and Sense Demons. I think it's a cool card. In Arena, this card sucks. Unless you somehow draft Infernos and Doomguards. Card actually turns out to be really good in Arena because you commonly do get those cards, but it is true that it sucks when you don't get those. I tried to pick Void Caller rather highly in Arena early on. In Constructed, Demon decks were attempted, and for some time they actually were pretty strong, but they just didn't quite carry that oomph to push them along, since Demons was never a thing. Reincarnate. Personally, I don't think it'll be that great. The thing that people are comparing it most notably on are you put Leroy, you reincarnate. Leroy, you hit the face for 6. You reincarnate. It's like the Shadow Step on Leroy. Rogue does it better because they have the 0 cost cards to go with Auctioneer. One of the other things is perhaps in a control shaman deck. Could be useful. But like, are you really using it just to reincarnate your Sylvanas and your Cairn? Is that worth a deck slot? Who knows? In Arena, this card will suck because it's too combo-y. Reincarnate's one of those cards where people will try to build a deck around, and it could be wildly successful, or it could not work, but it's a cool card. Boy, I sure hedged hard on that one. I was right in my instinct that it didn't quite warrant a spot. People did try to put it in the control-type shaman decks, and generally they weren't very successful. Also, I'm the master of hedging. Poison Seeds. This card currently sucks in Constructed, and might suck in general because there are decks out there like Zoo which have a lot of minions, and you destroying them all and replacing them with 2/2s might not actually be good. Everyone says, oh my gosh, Poison Seed Starfall combo! Costs 9 mana. Poison Seeds Thanos Swipe! Costs 10 mana. The card is very specific in what it does. Usually killing your own guys to trigger the death rattle isn't worth it. Pretty much the only situation where this is good is you're up against some very big cards. It's like the Druid hard removal. Hard. It's the Druid soft removal. It's too situational. In Arena, this card is even worse because you will always face decks which don't unfairly put out huge stuff, and you'll just be facing like medium guys, and you'll change their medium guys into slightly smaller guys. Maybe in a metagame where there's like 90% hand luck, it would be good. By the way, that's also why the Goblins versus Gnomes cards, which like benefit from your opponent having a lot of cards in their hand, are probably not going to see play either, because the metagame has to be quite specifically like hand luck or really heavy control cards, control decks rather. And people who suggested Poison Seeds and Starfall need to realize that 9 mana combos will rarely ever work out, probably never. Duplicate. I think out of the class cards, this one's the weakest. You compare it with a card like Arcane Elect, you pay 3 mana, you draw the 2 cards. But the catch with the duplicate is you can cheat it out sometimes, which is notably with Mod Scientist or with Kirin Tor Mage. So when your 0 mana duplicate draws you 2 cards, it's a little bit more interesting. And I would say duplicate by itself is not good enough, but when you combo it with a secret type deck, maybe it can work. Maybe. I personally think it's unlikely. In Arena, this card sucks. It's quite similar to the Paladin card Redemption, where you can't control what your opponent's going to kill, so they're going to kill something garbage. Okay, turned out to not be the worst class card. Turned out to be the card that actually was featured in a recent tournament as the best card in the deck, or the card that the deck was built around. It's better in constructed because it turns out that you can play exactly one minion and then have that minion be really good, or have that minion have taunt and then hide like your weaker cards behind it. Or have that card be Sludge Belcher, which is way better than people thought it was, also. And in Arena, it still turns out to, I would say, be a below average card, but actually playable. And pickable over quite a few cards. Originally, I was a bit more subdued about this card, but it's pretty good. You compare it with the True Silver Champion, which all the Paladins are running. Like, this effect is possibly better than that one. So I'm upping my stock of this one from maybe you would run one of it to maybe you would run two of it, and you would probably run one of it. The second one is a swipe. Of course, you take some face damage. And Warriors usually run synergetic cards, which deal stuff. You could see this in a control deck. You could see this in a new school aggro deck with Frothing Berserker and a lot of enraged things. It's pretty cool. In Arena, this card will be insane because True Silver is great. And this card will be just as good, if not better, because the 1 damage to all minions could be really significant. You'll probably almost never see an Arcanite Reaper be run anymore with Death Spite, unless you're playing in a super aggro deck where you run both Death Spite and Arcanite Reaper. I would say Death Spite pretty much outclasses Arcanite Reaper though. Well, as it turns out, I need to raise my stock of Death Spite even more from you definitely run one of it and maybe two of it too. You definitely run two of it. And I was even right, like it did show up in a new version of Warrior, the Math Warrior, where you play Frothing Berserker and you play charging things. But yeah, it's far better than I gave it credit for. People have said this is the best class card for good reason. 3 mana 3/4 doesn't exist in the game right now. The best you can get is a 3 mana 3/3. This is a 3 mana 3/4, and you get a cool ability with it. And this card's just really efficient. And the Death Rattle will sometimes come into play, and then you're possibly getting a 3 mana 3/7. Wow. Not much to say about this card other than the stats are really good. Might actually make priests not the worst class. Right now they're the least represented class. It's like, there's not much to say about this card. You're gonna put 2 copies into every single priest deck. In Arena, this card's gonna be really good. Mostly because of the stats. To no one's surprise, Dark Cultist was thought of as one of the best cards in Nax, and it did give Priest some love. Priest was one of the weakest cards before Nax came out. Priest is now a fairly competitive deck that you see quite a bit, and in every single Priest deck there's 2 Dark Cultists, to nobody's surprise. Perhaps one of the reasons, which I didn't touch on, is that it also has Death Rattle, which makes the Undertaker Priest viable as well. Avenge, this card is not good in a control deck, but in a rush deck, it's pretty good. 1 mana, give a 3/2 buff. Your opponent has to be the one to trade into your guy, but when you're playing an aggro deck, they're going to do that. It's a very niche card. You put it into an aggro paladin deck. Pretty good. Keep up the pressure, do a lot of damage. In Arena, this card's also going to be pretty good, since it's all minion-based combat. Probably will become the best secret in Arena. So you're going to see, when you're a paladin, more importantly, when you're facing against a paladin, you're not really going to know whether it's Avenge or whether or not it's Get Down. And then sometimes it's Redemption, so you actually start playing a guessing game, so it's cool. On a side note, I actually think that you might see a Secret Keeper Avenge Noble Sacrifice Redemption deck. That's kind of a stretch. Maybe. I tried out that deck. It was really bad. Avenge wasn't enough to push aggro paladin to be a thing. Maybe Goblins versus Gnomes will create enough aggressive decks for aggro paladin to be a thing. Yeah, just not enough good cards to make Paladin aggro beat out like Hunter aggro and Zoo. A new bar Ambusher. This is a card I really tried hard to put into a free-to-play rogue deck. It didn't work because it's Yeti and it only has 1 more attack, and the Death Rattle effect is too big. Probably bad. In Arena, this card is more acceptable. I think it's about average. It's more about value. Ambusher is a value slow card, but maybe you can afford the slowness in Arena. Yeah, pretty much right. It doesn't see any play. Drawback is too severe. And that is it. Wow. Of course, Nax is a really new set, so I reserve the right to change my opinion on cards. Wow, cool. And now we get to do another fade out. basically removed Starving Buzzard from the game. I'm not entirely sure what to say other than I think Hunter is gone. Poof. I was wrong.